They had been told that American shipyards required months, sometimes years, to construct a single aircraft carrier. The intelligence reports were clear, backed by decades of naval doctrine and industrial espionage. A fleet carrier was the most complex weapon of war ever conceived. A floating city of steel requiring thousands of skilled workers, intricate machinery, and careful orchestration of countless moving parts. The Japanese Naval General Staff had calculated everything based on this fundamental truth. But on a humid morning in August 1942, when Commander Yamamoto received the reconnaissance photographs from Pearl Harbor, his hands began to shake. The Americans had launched not one, not two, but 7 new carriers in the span of 90 days. It was impossible. Yet there they were, captured in grainy black and white, their flight decks stretching across the harbor like a rebuke to everything he thought he knew about industrial warfare. The photographs were passed from hand to hand in the cramped briefing room beneath the Naval Ministry in Tokyo. Each officer studied them with the intensity of men searching for proof of a magic trick, some hidden explanation that would restore order to their understanding of the world. The carriers were smaller than the Yorktown class, yes, but they were carriers nonetheless, capable of launching aircraft, of projecting power across the vast Pacific. And they were multiplying at a rate that defied every calculation, every strategic assumption upon which Japan's war plans had been built. Admiral Fukudome traced his finger along the flight deck of one vessel, then another, then another. His mind kept returning to a single, terrible question that he dared not speak aloud. What if American industrial might was not merely greater than Japan's, but existed in an entirely different category of possibility? The vessels in those photographs were called escort carriers, though the Americans had given them less dignified names. Baby flatops, Kaiser coffins, jeep carriers. They were born not in the storied naval shipyards of Newport News or Brooklyn, but in the commercial yards of the Pacific Coast, built by companies that had spent their existence constructing cargo ships and oil tankers. Henry Kaiser, the man who had engineered the Hoover Dam, had looked at the problem of carrier construction the way he looked at everything, as an engineering challenge to be solved through standardization, prefabrication, and relentless innovation. He had promised the Navy he could build a carrier in 3 months. The admirals had laughed. Kaiser had delivered the first one in 87 days. But it was not merely speed that made these vessels extraordinary. It was the process of their creation, a revolution in manufacturing that upended centuries of shipbuilding tradition. In the yards of Vancouver, Washington, and Richmond, California, workers were building sections of ships on assembly lines, treating a 20-ton hull segment the way Ford treated a car door. Welding had replaced riveting, reducing construction time by 60%. Prefabricated electrical systems, plumbing, and ventilation arrived as complete units, ready to be dropped into place like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Women who had never seen a ship before the war were now working acetylene torches, their hands guided by jigs and templates that removed the need for years of apprenticeship. The ships were building themselves, or so it seemed, emerging from the yards with a speed that appeared supernatural to observers trained in the old ways. Commander Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, studied the intelligence reports with growing unease. He had flown over the American fleet that December morning, had counted the battleships burning in the harbor, had felt the exhilaration of victory. But he had not bombed the fuel tanks, had not touched the repair facilities, had not eliminated the infrastructure that made the Pacific Fleet possible. That had been the mission's great oversight, though few admitted it at the time. Now, 9 months later, the Americans were not rebuilding their fleet, they were reinventing it. The escort carriers pouring out of Kaiser's yards were not elegant weapons, not the beautiful instruments of naval power that Japan's carriers represented. They were industrial products, manufactured with the brutal efficiency of a nation that had learned to mass-produce everything from cars to canned food. And there seemed to be no limit to how many the Americans could make. The Japanese had entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers, each one a masterpiece of naval engineering, crewed by pilots who had trained for years. They had believed, with some justification, that they possessed the finest carrier force in the world. The Americans had begun the war with 7 fleet carriers. But by the fall of 1942, even as Japan struggled to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway, the United States had added 24 escort carriers to its inventory. 24. The number appeared in Japanese planning documents like an accusation. Staff officers checked and rechecked the intelligence, certain there must be an error, some miscounting or misidentification. But the reconnaissance flights kept bringing back the same impossible truth. The Americans were building carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. In the Kaiser shipyards, the workers arrived in 3 shifts, the yards operating 24 hours a day under lights so bright they turned night into a harsh electric day. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung over the facilities like a permanent fog. Women in coveralls and headscarves worked alongside men too old for military service, teenage boys still learning their trades, and skilled craftsmen who had been pulled from retirement. They worked on vessels that barely resembled the carriers they had seen in newsreels. These ships were simpler, their superstructures minimal, their machinery commercial grade rather than military. They were built atop merchant ship hulls, oil tanker designs modified to carry aircraft instead of cargo. Everything about them represented a compromise, a surrender of elegance and capability in favor of speed and quantity. But quantity, the Americans understood, was its own form of quality. A fleet carrier like Enterprise could launch 90 aircraft, could fight in fleet actions, could project power deep into enemy territory. An escort carrier could launch 28 planes, but 20 escort carriers could launch 560 aircraft, could provide air cover for dozens of convoys simultaneously, could be everywhere the fleet carriers could not. The genius of the design was not in its sophistication but in its multiplication. The Japanese had built beautiful ships, had invested years in perfecting each vessel. The Americans had built good enough ships and had built them by the dozen. The psychological impact on the Japanese naval command cannot be overstated. They had been trained in a tradition that valued craftsmanship, that saw each ship as a work of martial art. The idea of a carrier that could be constructed in 3 months felt like a violation of natural law, a kind of industrial sorcery that should not be possible. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary that the American production figures must be propaganda, designed to demoralize Japan's fighting spirit. But submarines returning from reconnaissance missions along the American coast reported seeing multiple carriers under construction at single yards, their hulls rising simultaneously from the ways like a crop being harvested. The evidence became impossible to deny. America had found a way to industrialize naval warfare itself. The workers in Kaiser's yards did not think in strategic terms. They thought about their quotas, about the sections they needed to complete before the shift ended, about the sons and husbands fighting across the Pacific who needed these ships. A welder named Dorothy Morrison worked on the flight deck of USS Sangamon, her torch cutting through steel plate 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Her brother was a Marine, somewhere in the Solomon Islands. She did not know the name of the ship she was building, did not know its intended purpose or deployment. She knew only that each section she completed was one section closer to bringing him home. The ship was not abstract to her. It was a promise made of steel. The pace of construction created its own culture. Workers developed superstitions, rituals performed before each shift. A rigger named James Chen always touched the keel of whatever ship he was working on, a gesture of respect to the vessel and a prayer for the men who would sail it. The ships acquired personalities even as they were being built. Some were easy ships where everything fit correctly the first time. Others were fighters, vessels that resisted at every step, where nothing quite aligned and every section required adjustment. The workers spoke of the ships as if they were alive, as if the steel itself had opinions about how it should be shaped. And perhaps it did. Perhaps the urgency of war, the collective will of thousands of workers, imbued these vessels with something beyond mere material. Japanese intelligence officers attempted to understand the American system, to find its weaknesses or limitations. They studied captured documents, interrogated prisoners, analyzed photographs, They discovered that Kaiser had adapted techniques from the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam, that he had hired choreographers to study worker movements and eliminate wasted motion, that he had installed medical clinics at the yards to reduce time lost to injury. The Americans had turned shipbuilding into a science, had stripped away the artisanal traditions that Japan still honored. It was efficient, it was brutal, and it was working with a success that bordered on the terrifying. By 1943, the flood of escort carriers had fundamentally altered the naval balance in the Pacific. Japanese submarines, which had enjoyed remarkable success in the war's early months, found themselves hunted by aircraft from escort carriers dedicated to anti-submarine warfare. American amphibious assaults, once vulnerable during the critical hours between the initial landing and the arrival of land-based air support, now proceeded under constant air cover from escort carriers positioned just offshore. The small carriers were everywhere, plugging gaps in the American defensive perimeter, providing close air support to ground troops, training new pilots far from the front lines. They were not glamorous weapons. They rarely appeared in newspaper headlines, but they were suffocating Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. The Japanese attempted to respond with their own light carrier program, but the fundamental equation could not be changed. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's, its resource base already strained by years of war in China. The Naval General Staff approved plans for new carriers, but completion dates stretched years into the future. Materials were diverted to other priorities, to battleships and cruisers, to the defense of the home islands. And always, the intelligence reports brought news of more American carriers entering service. The gap was not closing, it was widening. In the officers' clubs of Tokyo and Yokosuka, the pilots who had survived the war's early campaigns drank sake and spoke carefully about what they had seen. They had been trained to respect the enemy's courage, but this was something else. This was an enemy who fought not with courage alone, but with a kind of inexorable industrial logic. For every Japanese carrier sunk, 3 American carriers appeared. For every aircraft destroyed, 10 more arrived from the factories of California and Michigan. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war, one where the factory was as important as the battlefield, where production quotas mattered as much as tactics. It was not a warrior's war. It was a war of accountants and engineers, and Japan was losing it. The escort carriers themselves were not particularly beloved by the American sailors who crewed them. They were slow, vulnerable to submarine attack, prone to rolling in heavy seas. Their thin hulls offered minimal protection against torpedoes. Their crews called them combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, a dark joke that reflected genuine anxiety about serving on vessels that could be built so quickly. If they could be constructed in 3 months, the reasoning went, how sturdy could they really be? But the sailors who served on them also recognized something else. These ships were present in nearly every major campaign from 1943 onward. They were at the invasions of Sicily and Normandy, at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. They may have been built quickly, but they were built to fight. The battle off Samar in October 1944 revealed what these humble vessels could accomplish when circumstances demanded it. A group of 6 escort carriers, part of Task Unit 77.4.3, found themselves under attack by a Japanese surface force that included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The escort carriers were armed with aircraft designed for ground support and anti-submarine work, not fleet actions. Their escorts consisted of destroyers and destroyer escorts, light vessels no match for battleships. By every conventional measure, the American force should have been annihilated, but the escort carriers launched every aircraft they had, arming torpedo bombers with depth charges because those were the only weapons available, sending fighters on strafing runs against armored battleships with machine guns that could barely penetrate the deck plating. The crews fought with a desperation born of understanding that there was no retreat, no rescue coming. USS Gambier Bay took multiple shell hits from battleship Yamato, her thin hull no match for 18-inch guns. She sank within hours. USS Street, Low was struck by a kamikaze and exploded in a fireball so intense that ships miles away felt the heat. But the other escort carriers survived, their aircraft harassing the Japanese force with such persistence that the enemy commander, believing he faced fleet carriers rather than escort carriers, ordered a withdrawal. The Americans had won through audacity and improvisation, through the willingness to throw everything they had against a superior force and trust that quantity and determination might substitute for quality and firepower. The Japanese officers who survived the battle reported attacking American carriers, and their reports were filed as another engagement in the long grinding struggle of the Pacific War. But in the analysis rooms in Tokyo, staff officers recognized what had happened. The Americans had fought escort carriers as if they were fleet carriers, had used mass-produced vessels in a role they were never designed for, and had somehow prevailed. The implications were devastating. If even America's second-rate carriers could defeat Japan's first-rate surface fleet, what hope remained? The war had become a mathematics problem with only one solution. By the spring of 1945, the United States had built over 100 escort carriers. They served as aircraft transports, training platforms, replenishment vessels, and in a dozen other unglamorous roles that kept the Pacific Fleet operating. They were not the weapons that won the great carrier battles. Those honors went to Essex and Enterprise, to the fleet carriers that the press celebrated and the public knew by name. But the escort carriers were the connective tissue of American naval power, the vessels that made everything else possible. They were, in their own unglamorous way, as revolutionary as the atomic bomb or radar. They represented the industrialization of naval power, the transformation of warfare into a production problem. Henry Kaiser never served in the military, never sailed on the ships his yards produced. He was an engineer and a businessman, a man who saw problems in terms of resources and processes, but his contribution to the Allied victory was as significant as that of any general or admiral. He had looked at the traditional method of shipbuilding and had seen inefficiency, wasted motion, outdated technique. He had applied the principles of mass production to the most complex weapon system in existence and had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The historians would later calculate that Kaiser's yards produced ships with 10 times the efficiency of traditional naval yards. 10 times. The number had the force of a weapon itself. The workers who built these ships went home when the war ended, returned to their previous lives, found new employment in the peacetime economy. Most of them never saw the vessels they had constructed, never learned the names of the ships or where they served. They had been part of an industrial miracle, but it had not felt miraculous at the time. It had felt like hard work, like long hours and sore muscles, like the satisfaction of completing a section correctly and moving to the next task. Years later, some of them would see photographs of escort carriers in history books and would feel a strange pride, a recognition that their hands had shaped that steel, that their labor had been transformed into history. The Japanese naval officers who survived the war wrote memoirs, tried to explain what had gone wrong, searched for the moment when the tide had turned against them. Some pointed to Midway, others to the attrition of the Solomons campaign, still others to the loss of experienced pilots who could never be replaced. But a few, the ones who had studied the intelligence reports most carefully, pointed to something else. They pointed to the moment when they realized that America could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them, that the industrial equation had no solution, that the war had been lost not on the battlefield but in the shipyards of the Pacific coast. They had fought bravely, had won great victories in the war's early months, but they had been fighting an enemy who could absorb losses and come back stronger, who could turn every defeat into a lesson and every loss into motivation for greater production. It was not the strength of American carriers that had defeated Japan, but their multiplicity, not the sophistication of their design, but the relentlessness of their construction. The escort carriers were not superior weapons. They were sufficient weapons, produced in such numbers that sufficiency became overwhelming. Japan had entered the war with better pilots, better torpedoes, often better tactics. But tactics could not overcome the fundamental reality that America could build 10 ships in the time it took Japan to build one. The mathematics of war had asserted themselves with pitiless clarity, and mathematics did not care about warrior spirit or naval tradition or the beauty of a ship's lines. The last of the escort carriers was decommissioned in the 1972nd, 3 decades after the war's end. They had served in Korea and Vietnam, had been converted to helicopter carriers and amphibious assault ships, had been sold to other navies or broken up for scrap. They did not have the glamorous afterlife of Enterprise or Yorktown, did not become museums or memorials. They were utilitarian to the end, used until they were no longer useful, and then disposed of with the same practical efficiency that had characterized their construction. It was, in a way, a fitting end for vessels that had never aspired to glory, only to effectiveness. The workers who built these ships are mostly gone now, their generation passing into history. The yards where the carriers were constructed have been converted to other uses or demolished entirely. The techniques Kaiser pioneered have been refined and superseded by new methods, new technologies. But the fundamental lesson of the escort carrier program remains relevant. War is not only about tactics and training and technology, it is also about production and resources and the ability to sustain effort over time. The side that can build faster, that can replace losses more quickly, that can turn its industrial capacity into military power most efficiently, possesses an advantage that no amount of battlefield courage can overcome. The Japanese generals who looked at those reconnaissance photographs in 1942 were experiencing a kind of conceptual defeat that preceded any battlefield loss. They were seeing the future of warfare, a future where production mattered more than tradition, where quantity had become its own quality, where ships could build themselves through the dark alchemy of mass production. They had been trained to think of war in terms of decisive battles, of fleet actions where superior training and tactics would decide the outcome. But the escort carriers represented a different philosophy of war, one where the decisive battle was already over before the first shot was fired, won or lost in the factories and shipyards, in the steel mills and the aluminum plants. There is something almost melancholy in this realization, a recognition that war had become impersonal, industrial, removed from the traditions of honor and individual prowess that had defined naval combat for centuries. The escort carriers were not ships that inspired poetry or paintings. They were functional, utilitarian, built to accomplish a mission and nothing more. But perhaps that is the truest face of modern war, stripped of its romantic illusions. War is not beautiful. It is a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome through organization and effort, and the efficient application of resources. The escort carriers understood this truth. They were built to win, not to be admired, and they did their job with an effectiveness that changed the course of history. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.